What if I told you the United States Army once dropped actual bombs from actual airplanes onto actual American citizens, not overseas? West Virginia, Oklahoma, U.S. soil, U.S. citizens, U.S. forces. Or that for roughly a year and a half, the executive branch was quietly run by a first lady nobody elected, while the White House hid how badly her husband's stroke had actually left him. Or that the Supreme Court once ruled, clearly and in writing, for a native nation, and a sitting president simply chose not to listen. No consequences, no do-over, just ignored. You'd be forgiven for assuming I'm exaggerating for views. I'm not. Every fact you're about to hear lives in a court transcript, a congressional record, a declassified file, or a newspaper archive gathering dust in some university basement. Verifiable, sourced, real. Before we get into it, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, drop a like. This channel survives on an algorithm that would much rather serve you something comfortable than the parts of American history quietly left out of the textbook, and every one of you watching helps these stories actually find people. So dim the lights, get horizontal, let your eyes go heavy, and settle in for 50 facts your history class never got around to. Let's start right at the beginning, before the country had even finished being built. 1783, a cold camp in Newburgh, New York. Fact number 1. The Newburgh Conspiracy. It's March 1783. The Revolutionary War is basically won, but the brand new Congress is flat broke, and the officers of the Continental Army haven't been paid in months, sometimes years. They're camped in Newburgh, New York, cold, owed, and increasingly furious. So a group of officers start passing around anonymous letters, suggesting, not so subtly, that maybe it's time the army stopped asking Congress nicely and started making some demands with bayonets attached. The letters were unsigned, polished, clearly written by someone educated, and historians eventually traced the likely author to Major John Armstrong Jr., an aide with close ties to men in Congress who wanted the Army's leverage used to strong-arm the states into funding the national government properly. Some historians think it was a genuine threat of a military coup against the civilian government America had just fought a war to create. Others think it was posturing, maybe even encouraged quietly by allies of Alexander Hamilton, meant to scare Congress into paying up without anyone actually intending to march. Either way, a meeting was called in a camp building the officers nicknamed the Temple, and General George Washington heard about it and showed up uninvited. He gave a speech asking the officers to trust the process. It wasn't landing, so he reached into his coat for a letter from a congressman, paused, and pulled out a pair of glasses almost nobody had ever seen him wear in public. "Gentlemen," he said, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray but almost blind in the service of my country." That's it, that's the whole trick. Grown men who had survived years of combat reportedly wept. The coup talk evaporated on the spot. Congress eventually paid up, and the entire idea of the American military as an institution that answers to civilians instead of the other way around may have survived because one man knew exactly when to put on his glasses. Which is a nice story about a coup that didn't happen. Fact number 2 is about a war the government actually did wage against its own taxpayers. The Whiskey Rebellion, 1794. Congress, pushed hard by Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, passes a tax on distilled spirits to help pay down war debt, and out on the western Pennsylvania frontier, where whiskey doubles as currency because hauling grain to market is a nightmare, and hauling whiskey isn't, farmers are livid. Protests turn into tarring and feathering tax collectors, burning down a regional inspector's house, and eventually a few thousand armed men gathering outside Pittsburgh. President Washington, the same man who'd talked officers out of a coup a decade earlier, decides this time diplomacy is over. He personally puts on his old uniform, mounts a horse, and leads roughly 13,000 militiamen drawn from 4 states, more soldiers than he'd commanded at most Revolutionary War battles, out into the Pennsylvania hills to put down his own citizens. Hamilton himself rode along for part of the campaign, apparently eager to see his tax policy enforced in person. It remains, to this day, the only time a sitting American president has personally commanded troops in the field. By the time the army arrived, most of the rebels had scattered into the hills rather than fight the largest force in the country. A handful of men were arrested and marched back to Philadelphia for trial. 2 were convicted of treason, and both were pardoned by Washington himself. No massive bloodbath. But the message was unmistakable. The new federal government could and would put an army in your backyard over unpaid taxes. Which brings us to a government that decided taxes weren't the only thing you weren't allowed to complain about. Fact number 3. The Sedition Act of 1798. John Adams is president. Tensions with France are boiling, and Adams's Federalist-controlled Congress passes a set of laws making it a federal crime to publish, quote, false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government. It came packaged alongside a set of companion alien acts making it easier to deport or detain immigrants, all justified as national security measures in case the standoff with France turned into open war. In plain language, though, the sedition half of the package meant criticizing the president or Congress could now land you in jail. And it did. Roughly 25 people were arrested under the law, about 10 of them convicted. Nearly all of them editors or writers aligned with the opposing political party. One target, the newspaperman Benjamin Franklin Bache, grandson of Benjamin Franklin himself, was arrested and awaiting trial when he died of yellow fever before the case could even go forward. The most striking case, though, is Congressman Matthew Lyon of Vermont, a sitting member of the House of Representatives who was convicted, fined, and thrown in a jail cell for 4 months for criticizing President Adams in print. Here's the kicker. While he was sitting in that cell, his district re-elected him to Congress anyway, by a wider margin than before. He served part of his term as an actual sitting inmate. The Sedition Act quietly expired in 1801, and the whole episode is usually reduced in the textbook to a sentence or two. But for a few years, the country that had just fought a revolution over things like unrepresentative government was actively jailing the people who disagreed with it out loud. And speaking of politicians who ended up on the wrong side of a courtroom, fact number 4 takes us to the sitting Vice President of the United States, on trial for treason. Aaron Burr, 1805 to 1807. Burr had already shot and killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel in 1804, which tends to end a political career, and it did. So out of office and reportedly out of options, Burr headed west, gathered supplies and men on an island in the Ohio River belonging to a wealthy supporter named Harmon Blennerhassett, and started assembling what looked from a distance like a small private army. Depending on which historian and which set of letters you believe, he either planned to carve an independent empire out of Spanish territory in the Southwest, or planned to seize part of the Louisiana Purchase for himself, or was simply scouting land deals that got wildly misread by nervous rivals. The man who blew the whistle was General James Wilkinson, Burr's own co-conspirator, and, as later records would confirm, a paid agent of the Spanish crown the whole time, who sent an alarmed letter to President Jefferson accusing Burr of treason to save his own skin. Jefferson, no fan of Burr's to begin with, publicly declared him guilty before any trial had even happened, which is not generally how the justice system is supposed to work. Burr was arrested, hauled to Virginia, and put on trial for his life, with Chief Justice Marshall himself traveling to preside over a case Jefferson was watching closely. And then Burr walked. Chief Justice John Marshall, presiding over the case personally, ruled that treason under the Constitution required an actual overt act witnessed by 2 people, and the prosecution simply didn't have that. Burr was acquitted on the narrowest of technical grounds, though the acquittal didn't exactly clear his name in the public imagination, and he spent years afterward in self-imposed exile in Europe, reportedly trying and failing to drum up support from foreign governments for further schemes, before quietly returning to practice law in New York under an assumed name, of all the ordinary places to land after nearly building yourself a private empire on the frontier. So that's 4 facts deep into a republic that was barely a few decades old, officers flirting with a coup, a president marching an army against his own voters, a Congress jailing its critics, and a vice president on trial for treason. And we haven't even gotten to slavery yet, which the textbook tends to compress into a single tidy chapter with a start date and an end date, as if it were one clean story instead of decades of uprisings, loopholes, and forced labor that outlasted the Civil War by generations. That's where we're headed next, the parts of the slavery era the textbook skipped, starting with an uprising bigger than anything you were probably ever taught happened on American soil at all. Fact number 5, the German Coast Uprising, and it deserves the word uprising, not the diminished word riot most textbooks use if they mention it at all. It's January 1811, along a stretch of sugar plantations the locals called the German coast, roughly 40 miles up the Mississippi River from New Orleans. On the night of January 8th, an enslaved man named Charles Deslandes, a driver on the Andrew plantation, who almost certainly used that position of relative trust to plan for months, leads a small group of men out into the night. They wound the plantation owner, kill his son, seize weapons, drums, horses, and captured militia coats, and start marching down the river road toward New Orleans, gathering people from plantation after plantation as they go. By the next morning, the column has grown to somewhere between 200 and 500 people, depending on which contemporary account you trust, organized into military-style companies, flags flying, drums keeping time, dressed in whatever uniforms they'd taken. It remains, by sheer number of participants, the largest slave revolt in United States history. It lasted about 2 days. Territorial militia and federal troops under General Wade Hampton, along with a hastily assembled planter force, caught up with the column roughly 20 miles from the city and cut it apart. Somewhere around 95 people were killed in the fighting or executed afterward in summary trials that lasted minutes. And then came the part meant to make sure nobody forgot the lesson, or rather meant to make sure everyone forgot the uprising itself, while remembering only the punishment. The heads of the executed were mounted on pikes along the river road for miles, all the way into New Orleans, left there for weeks. Territorial Governor William C. Claiborne, writing to Washington afterward, seemed almost more relieved than alarmed, treating the whole thing as a contained nuisance rather than what it actually was, an organized march on the largest city in the region by hundreds of people who had planned it for months and very nearly pulled it off. For most of the next 2 centuries, this barely appears in American history books. It took historians like Daniel Rasmussen, digging through Louisiana's territorial court records generations later for his 2011 book on the uprising, to reconstruct what actually happened in any real detail, and it wasn't until relatively recently, notably a 2019 procession as art installation that retraced the rebels' original route along the river road with hundreds of participants, that the event got anything resembling public memory to match its scale. Which brings us to fact number 6, a different kind of forgetting. An entire constitutional amendment protecting slavery that most Americans have never heard of, mostly because it never quite got a chance to matter. The Corwin Amendment, 1861. As the country was splitting apart in the weeks before Lincoln's inauguration, Congress made one last attempt to hold the Union together, and its solution was not to limit slavery. It was to make slavery permanently untouchable. Named for the Ohio congressman who introduced it, the amendment would have barred the federal government forever from ever interfering with slavery in any state where it already existed. Not temporarily, constitutionally, permanently, off the table for future amendment. It passed both the House and the Senate by the required 2/3 margins in early March 1861. And here's the detail that tends to surprise people. Incoming President Abraham Lincoln, in his first inaugural address, the same speech, said he had no objection to it being made express and irrevocable. He wasn't its author, and he framed it as already implied by existing law, but he did not oppose it. 3 states, Ohio, Maryland, and a since contested ratification in Illinois, actually ratified it before the war made the whole question academic. Because Congress never attached a ratification deadline, the Corwin Amendment technically never died. It simply never reached the 3/4 of states required, and it is, as far as anyone can tell, still sitting there, open, unratified, unrescinded, a permanent slavery amendment that a war interrupted, rather than a Congress repealed. Secretary of State William Seward, the man whose job it eventually became to certify ratified amendments, would go on to help oversee the actual 13th Amendment 4 years later, the one that abolished slavery instead of enshrining it, which is either a remarkable coincidence of timing or the clearest possible illustration of how fast the ground shifted once the war actually started. Unlike an amendment nobody bothered to hide, fact number 7 is about something built specifically to disappear, a ship. The Clotilda, 1860. By this point, importing enslaved people from Africa into the United States had been federally illegal for 52 years. Didn't stop a mobile Alabama businessman named Timothy Mayer, who reportedly made a bet that he could smuggle a shipload of captive Africans past federal authorities without getting caught. He hired Captain William Foster, sent him to the Kingdom of Dahomey in West Africa, and had him purchase somewhere around 110 captives, sailing them back across the Atlantic on a fast schooner called the Clotilda. It worked, in the narrow sense that nobody got arrested. To destroy the evidence, Foster towed the ship up a tributary of the Mobile River, transferred the captives under cover of darkness, and burned the Clotilda to the waterline, sinking what was left. 5 years later, slavery ended, and the survivors, unable to afford passage back to West Africa, pooled what little money they could earn and bought land, some of it from Mayer himself, to found their own community outside Mobile, Africa Town, where they kept their own languages, customs, and names alive for generations. One of them, a man born Oluwole Kosola and renamed Kudjo Lewis, lived until 1935, long enough to be interviewed at length by the writer Zora Neale Hurston in the late 1920s and even captured on film, one of the only moving image records of someone who survived the Middle Passage. Hurston's manuscript about him, titled Barracoon, sat unpublished for almost 90 years, reportedly because publishers at the time wanted it rewritten in conventional English instead of Kosola's own dialect, and it didn't actually reach print until 2018. The wreck itself stayed a local rumor for 150 years, mentioned in old newspaper clippings and family stories, but never confirmed, until marine archaeologists finally identified the burned hull of the Clotilda buried in the mud of the Mobile River in 2019, giving Africa Town's descendants physical proof of a crime their ancestors had been describing the entire time. And if you think the story ends there, at emancipation, with a war won and the amendments ratified, fact number 8 is the uncomfortable footnote textbooks tend to skip straight past. Slavery, under different paperwork, didn't actually stop in 1865. Convict leasing and debt peonage, roughly 1865 through the early 1940s. Southern states passed vagrancy laws and so-called black codes broad enough to arrest freedmen for things like being unemployed or simply standing in the wrong place, and then lease their labor out to plantations, coal mines, and railroad companies, often for pennies a day paid to the state, not the worker. In some ways it was worse than slavery had been. In the coldest economic sense, a plantation owner who'd bought a person outright had at least some financial incentive to keep that person alive. A company leasing convict labor by the month did not, and mortality rates in some camps and mines were brutal. Alongside it ran debt peonage, where sharecroppers and tenant farmers were kept perpetually in debt to landowners through manipulated accounting, sometimes held on the land by armed guards if they tried to leave. Federal peonage laws existed on the books the entire time. Enforcement, for roughly 80 years, was close to non-existent. What finally changed it wasn't a court ruling or a civil rights campaign. It was Pearl Harbor. Days after the attack, in December 1941, Attorney General Francis Biddle issued Circular No. 3591, directing federal prosecutors nationwide to actually pursue slavery and peonage cases aggressively, in large part, historians argue, because the government did not want Axis propaganda pointing at forced labor happening on American soil, while the country fought a war partly framed around freedom. It took a world war and a public relations problem to get Washington to enforce laws that had already existed for generations. Even then, enforcement stayed patchy for years, and it would take journalist Douglas Blackmon's Pulitzer-winning research decades later, tracing individual leasing contracts and county arrest ledgers, to lay out just how deliberately the system had been built and how long it had been allowed to run in plain sight. So that's the slavery chapter. The textbook tends to condense into a single tidy unit, an uprising bigger than most people are ever told about, an amendment that would have made bondage permanent, a smuggling ship burned to hide a federal crime, and a system of forced labor that limped on for 80 more years under new names. None of it required a conspiracy to stay hidden. It just required nobody teaching it. The story the country tells itself about the frontier, cowboys, wagon trains, manifest destiny, has its own set of chapters nobody assigned you either. That's where we're headed next. Fact number 9. Let's start with a Supreme Court ruling that actually went the right way and got ignored anyway. Worcester v. Georgia, 1832. Georgia had been passing laws trying to seize Cherokee land and dissolve Cherokee self-government, and the case that reached the Supreme Court asked essentially whether the state had any legal authority to do that at all. Chief Justice John Marshall, the same justice who'd presided over Aaron Burr's treason trial a generation earlier, wrote the majority opinion, and it was about as clear as Supreme Court opinions get. The Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community with its own territory. Georgia's laws had no force within it, and only the federal government had any standing to deal with Cherokee affairs in the first place. The Cherokee had won, on paper, completely. President Andrew Jackson's administration simply declined to enforce it. There's a famous line supposedly attributed to Jackson, something like John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it, and you'll see it quoted everywhere as if it's a matter of record. Worth flagging? Historians generally consider that exact quote likely apocryphal, with no contemporary source ever actually placing those words in Jackson's mouth. What isn't in dispute is that Jackson privately dismissed the ruling as unenforceable nonsense, and did nothing to stop Georgia from proceeding exactly as it had planned. Congress had already passed the Indian Removal Act 2 years earlier, and with the Supreme Court's actual ruling quietly shelved, the machinery kept moving. A related case the year before, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, had already described the tribe as a domestic dependent nation, a phrase still cited in federal Indian law today, but even that framing brought no real protection once the state and the executive branch simply agreed to ignore the court together. By 1838, under Jackson's successor, federal troops under General Winfield Scott rounded Cherokee families into hastily built stockades before marching the Cherokee Nation roughly 1,000 miles west along what's now remembered as the Trail of Tears. And by most estimates, as many as 4,000 of the 16,000 or so Cherokee forced to make that march did not survive it, dying of cold, disease, and starvation along the route. A Supreme Court ruling on the books in writing that changed nothing because nobody with an army was interested in enforcing it, which tells you something about how the rest of the westward expansion tended to work. It wasn't just Washington looking the other way. Sometimes the states did the paying themselves. Fact number 10. California's state-funded militia campaigns, roughly the 1850s through the 1860s. After California became a state in 1850, its legislature started authorizing and directly funding local militia expeditions, essentially state-sanctioned mercenary campaigns against native communities across the new state, and then submitted the bills to Congress for reimbursement. Congress paid. Over the following years, the federal government reimbursed California more than $1 million for these campaigns, funding operations that killed uncounted numbers of native Californians and destroyed villages, food stores, and entire communities. California's first governor, Peter Burnett, said the quiet part out loud in an 1851 message to the state legislature, predicting that a war of extermination will continue to be waged against native people until, in his words, the race became extinct. Their words, not mine, but they're worth repeating exactly because a sitting governor put that sentence into an official state document rather than a private letter. Population numbers tell the rest of the story without much need for commentary. An estimated 150,000 native Californians at the time of statehood had collapsed to somewhere around 30,000 within about 2 decades, driven by militia violence, disease, starvation, and forced labor arrangements, some formalized under the state's own 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of Indians that let native children and adults be bound into unpaid servitude under the thin legal cover of apprenticeship. It took until 2019 for a sitting California governor to formally apologize on the state's behalf, using the word genocide in an official proclamation and establishing a Truth and Healing Council to document what the state-funded campaigns had actually done, 170 years after his predecessor had more or less announced the intention in writing. Fact number 11 takes us to a march, not entirely unlike the Trail of Tears in shape, that gets even less classroom time. The Long Walk of the Navajo, 1864. As part of a broader campaign to force the Navajo, or Diné, onto a reservation, the Army, under Kit Carson, waged a scorched earth campaign across Navajo homeland, burning crops, destroying orchards, killing livestock, systematically removing any way for people to feed themselves through the winter until starvation did the work bullets hadn't. Facing that, somewhere around 8,000 to 10,000 Navajo surrendered and were then forced to walk, in multiple groups over several months, roughly 300 miles to a desolate reservation called Bosque Redondo in eastern New Mexico. The walk itself killed people through exposure and exhaustion, and conditions at Bosque Redondo were worse. Alkaline water unfit for drinking, repeated crop failures, disease and starvation running through a population confined alongside a rival tribe, the Mescalero Apache. In overcrowded, unsanitary conditions the Army had done essentially nothing to prepare for. By most estimates, something like a quarter of the people interned there died before the ordeal ended. It ended unusually for this kind of story with something resembling a reversal. Navajo leaders, including a headman named Barboncito, negotiated directly with a federal commission in 1868, and the resulting Treaty of Bosque Redondo let the surviving Navajo return to a portion of their original homeland. One of the rare instances in this entire era where a removed nation was allowed to go home rather than being permanently resettled somewhere else. And if you're wondering how this pattern of ignored courts, funded campaigns, and forced marches eventually ends, fact number 12 is generally where historians mark the closing chapter of the so-called Indian Wars. And it isn't a battle. It's a massacre. Wounded Knee, December 29, 1890, South Dakota. The backdrop was the Ghost Dance movement, a spiritual revival spreading across Lakota reservations that federal agents had grown nervous enough about to send in troops, and just 2 weeks earlier, the Lakota leader Sitting Bull had been killed during an attempt to arrest him at his home over fears he'd joined the movement. Against that backdrop, soldiers of the 7th Cavalry, the same regiment Custer had commanded at Little Bighorn 14 years earlier, surrounded a band of Lakota led by Spotted Elk, also known as Bigfoot, near Wounded Knee Creek, and moved to disarm them. Accounts differ on exactly how the shooting started, whether a single rifle discharged accidentally during the search or a deliberate act, but once it did, soldiers opened fire with rifles and rapid-firing Hotchkiss guns positioned on the surrounding hills, into a camp that included women and children. Estimates of the dead range from around 250 to 300 Lakota, the wide range itself a reflection of how little care was taken afterward to actually count, with many killed while trying to flee across open ground. Roughly 25 soldiers died as well, some reportedly from their own side's crossfire. The dead were later gathered and buried in a mass grave at the site, a burial photograph that's since become one of the era's most reproduced and grimmest images. In the aftermath, the Army awarded approximately 20 medals of honor, the nation's highest military decoration, to soldiers who took part. Efforts to formally rescind those medals have gone on for years, revisited periodically by Congress, tribal advocates, and the Pentagon, and as of this recording, most of them still remain on the official record. Unrevoked, the government's highest honor for valor attached to an event most Americans would recognize, if they recognized it at all, as a massacre rather than a battle. So that's the frontier the textbook mythology tends to leave out. A Supreme Court ruling nobody enforced, a state government that put its extermination policy in writing and got federal money for it, a forced march that only partly reversed itself, and a massacre still, on paper, decorated for bravery. None of it required hiding a conspiracy. It just required leaving the paperwork in the archive instead of the curriculum, and letting a couple of generations of textbook writers decide westward expansion sounded tidier than what the court records actually describe. And once the country had finished filling in every last acre of that continent, it turned out the appetite didn't stop at the coastline. It just started looking across the ocean instead, which is where we're headed next. So that's the West. A Supreme Court ruling ignored, a state paying militias to shrink its own native population, a forced march through the desert, and a massacre that somehow earned medals instead of courts-martial. With the continent fully claimed, the next question was simple. What does a country like that do once the land runs out? The answer is it looks for land somewhere else. And it gets a lot quieter about how it gets it. Fact number 13, the overthrow of Hawaii. It's January 1893, and the Kingdom of Hawaii has its own monarchy, its own constitution, its own standing as a recognized sovereign nation, treaties with the United States and all. Queen Liliuokalani, newly on the throne, wants to restore some of the power the monarchy had lost to a group of American and European sugar planters who'd spent years quietly writing themselves into the government. Those planters, unhappy with that plan, organize a coup. And here's the part that doesn't sound like ancient history. The U.S. minister to Hawaii, a man named John Stevens, orders Marines off the USS Boston and onto the streets of Honolulu, officially to protect American lives and property, which somehow translates to standing around outside the palace while businessmen depose a queen. Liliuokalani, to avoid a bloodbath she knew she couldn't win, yields under protest, and I do mean under protest. She formally appeals directly to the U.S. government to undo what had just been done to her. President Grover Cleveland actually looks into it, commissions an investigation, and the resulting report concludes, in writing, that the overthrow was illegal and that Minister Stevens had wildly overstepped his authority. Cleveland calls for the Queen's restoration. The new provisional government, run by the same businessmen who just deposed her, simply says no. Cleveland doesn't force the issue. Hawaii gets annexed anyway in 1898, folded in during the excitement of the Spanish-American War, using a simple joint resolution that only needed a majority vote in both houses rather than the two-thirds Senate treaty vote annexation was actually supposed to require. One of the men who'd helped depose her, Sanford Dole, becomes the first governor of the new territory. Liliuokalani herself lives on for another 2 decades under the flag that replaced hers, writing music, including the song Aloha, which outlives the monarchy by well over a century. It takes almost exactly 100 years for Washington to formally reckon with any of it. In 1993, Congress passes a joint resolution signed by President Clinton, apologizing to Native Hawaiians for the overthrow of their kingdom. 100 years is a long time to wait for an apology nobody in power actually has to act on. Which brings us to the war America fought immediately afterward, over a country it had just finished promising to liberate. Fact number 14, the Philippine-American War. The Spanish-American War of 1898 ends with Spain handing the Philippines over to the United States for $20 million, a real estate transaction involving several million people who were not consulted. The problem is that Filipino revolutionaries under Emilio Aguinaldo had already been fighting Spain for their independence and assumed reasonably that American help meant American support for that independence. Instead, in February 1899, fighting breaks out between Filipino forces and the army that had just liberated them, and it turns into a grinding, years-long counterinsurgency. American soldiers used what they called the water cure, forcing gallons of water down a prisoner's throat until the stomach distended, then forcing it back out, sometimes by standing on the abdomen, to extract information or simply as punishment. After Filipino fighters kill roughly 48 American soldiers in a surprise attack on the island of Samar, General Jacob Smith gives an order that's been quoted in congressional testimony ever since. Kill everyone capable of bearing arms against the United States, he says, setting the age limit at 10 years old, and turn the interior of Samar into what he called a howling wilderness. Villages are burned, crops destroyed, populations herded into what were essentially concentration camps to cut off support for the resistance. Estimates of Filipino civilian deaths, from combat, famine, and disease combined, run at 200,000 and climb higher in some scholarly counts. General Smith is eventually court-martialed for his order. His punishment, admonished, and quietly allowed to retire. Roughly 4,200 American soldiers died too, mostly of disease. Back home, the war is genuinely controversial. An anti-imperialist league forms an opposition to it, and Mark Twain, one of its most famous members, writes scathing essays comparing American conduct in the Philippines to the very colonial abuses the country claimed to stand against. None of that stops it. The war is officially declared over in 1902. Guerrilla fighting continues in places for years after that. And once you've done that once, in one country, it turns out to be a habit that's very hard to break. Fact number 15 takes us into what historians now just call the Banana Wars, decades of U.S. military interventions across Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Honduras, and Mexico, usually to protect American business interests, often literal banana and sugar companies with names like United Fruit, sometimes dressed up as stabilizing fragile governments. Marines occupy Haiti for 19 straight years, from 1915 to 1934. They occupy Nicaragua on and off for over 2 decades. The man at the center of an enormous number of these interventions is Major General Smedley Butler, the most decorated Marine of his era, a 2-time Medal of Honor recipient who spent 33 years fighting in the Philippines, in China during the Boxer Rebellion, in Honduras, Nicaragua, Mexico, Haiti, and France during World War I. You may remember Butler from an earlier video on this channel, when a group of wealthy businessmen allegedly tried to recruit him for something considerably more sinister back home. We're not retelling that one here. What matters for this fact is what Butler did after he retired in 1931. He wrote a short, blistering book called War is a Racket, and started touring the country, giving speeches laying out in plain language, exactly what those 33 years had actually been. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, he said, and during that period I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. Those are his words from the man who did the fighting, not some outside critic guessing at motives. Elsewhere in the same speeches, he ran through his own resume like a rap sheet, helping make Mexico, and particularly Tampico, safe for American oil interests, helping make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank to collect its revenues, helping purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers. Coming from a 2-time Medal of Honor recipient describing his own career, it lands very differently than it would coming from a critic on the outside. Fact number 16, and this one didn't even require an ocean crossing to be strange. War Plan read. In 1930, the U.S. Army and Navy formally approve a contingency plan, one of a whole rainbow of color-coded war plans the military kept on the shelf for different potential enemies, and red is the color assigned to the British Empire. Buried inside it is a detailed plan for invading Canada in the event of a war with Britain, including seizing the port of Halifax early to cut off British reinforcements from crossing the Atlantic, and pushing toward major Canadian cities like Winnipeg and Quebec. It isn't some fringe daydream sitting in a drawer either. It's an approved plan, updated as late as 1934 and 1935, with actual funding funneled toward building airfields near the Canadian border, discreetly justified to Congress as civilian aviation infrastructure. It stays classified until 1974, when it's declassified along with the rest of the color plans and mostly treated as a historical curiosity by then. Here's the detail that tends to get left out. Canada had already thought of this. Back in 1921, a Canadian officer named Buster Sutherland Brown had drawn up Defense Scheme No. 1, an actual plan for small, fast Canadian units to punch across the border into towns like Albany, Minneapolis, and Seattle the moment war looked likely, not to conquer the United States, but to disrupt and delay an American invasion long enough for the British to arrive. 2 allied countries, sharing the longest undefended border on Earth, quietly drawing up invasion plans against each other, just in case. Neither plan was ever used, both stayed on paper. But paper is exactly the kind of thing that eventually gets declassified. And that's 16 facts down, which means we're not even a third of the way through, and your eyelids should already be getting heavier. 34 facts still to go, so get comfortable, because it turns out the Empire wasn't the only thing America was quietly fighting. It was also fighting its own workforce. Welcome back. We're leaving the Empire behind for a while to look somewhere closer to home. It turns out the government didn't only send armies after foreign countries and native nations. Sometimes it sent them after its own coal miners. Fact number 17. The Ludlow Massacre. It's April 20th, 1914, in southern Colorado, and roughly 1,200 coal miners and their families are living in a tent colony called Ludlow, having been evicted from company housing months earlier for going on strike against the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, a business majority owned by the Rockefeller family. The miners want basic things: better pay, safer conditions, and the right to live somewhere that isn't entirely controlled by the company that employs them. What they get instead is the Colorado National Guard, funded in part by the very mine operators they're striking against, setting up machine guns on the ridge above the tent colony and opening fire. Over the course of the day, the tents catch fire. Whether deliberately torched or simply set alight in the chaos is still argued over by historians. What's not argued over is what searchers find the next morning, in a pit dug beneath one of the burned tents where a group of women and children had hidden for safety. 2 women and 11 children suffocated. The death toll for the day runs somewhere between 19 and 25 people, depending on which count you use, but it's that pit that gives the massacre its name in labor history and its lasting horror. The backlash was immediate and national. Striking miners across the region armed themselves and fought company guards and militia for another 10 days, an episode historians call the Colorado Coalfield War, until President Woodrow Wilson sent in federal troops to finally end it. John D. Rockefeller Jr., who owned a controlling stake in the company and had publicly insisted the strikers were the aggressors, took such a public relations beating over Ludlow that he hired one of the first professional public relations men in American history, Ivy Lee, specifically to repair his image afterward. A year later, Rockefeller himself traveled to the Colorado coalfields and helped design a company-controlled employee representation plan meant to head off future strikes without ever actually recognizing an independent union, a model other large employers would go on to copy for decades. Which, if you think armed miners fighting a state militia for 10 days sounds like the peak of American labor conflict, wait until you hear about the sequel 7 years later. Fact number 18. The Battle of Blair Mountain. It's the closest thing to actual battlefield warfare the American labor movement ever produced. By the summer of 1921, coal miners across southern West Virginia are trying to unionize, and mine operators are fighting back with company guards, blacklists, and private detective agencies notorious for violent strike breaking. Tensions boil over into an armed march, somewhere around 10,000 Union miners, many of them World War I veterans who genuinely know how to use a rifle, head toward Logan County to confront Sheriff Don Chafin's forces. Roughly 3,000 deputies, mine guards, and hired strikebreakers dug into positions along Blair Mountain. For nearly 5 days they fight. Estimates of rounds fired run as high as 1 million. And here's the detail that should sound familiar if you were paying attention to the opening of this video. Coal operators hire private planes, leftover surplus from the war, and use them to drop homemade bombs on the miners below, some of them actual unexploded ordnance repurposed for the occasion. It's very likely the first time aircraft ever dropped bombs on American citizens on American soil. It only ends when President Warren Harding, after ordering the miners to disperse and being ignored, sends in federal troops backed by U.S. Army Air Service planes under Billy Mitchell for reconnaissance. Faced with actual federal soldiers instead of a sheriff's posse, the miners largely stand down. It remains the largest armed uprising on American soil since the Civil War, and for most of a century afterward, it barely rated a paragraph in the history books it should have anchored. The battlefield itself very nearly disappeared too, when preservationists got part of the mountain listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2009. Coal companies with mountaintop removal permits nearby got it delisted within months on a technicality, and it took another lawsuit before the listing was restored. Even the ground the battle was fought on had to fight to stay remembered. Which brings us backward a bit in time, to the strike that accidentally invented one of your favorite long weekends. Fact number 19. The Pullman Strike of 1894. The Pullman Palace Car Company, just outside Chicago, builds an entire company town for its workers, complete with company housing, company stores, company churches, all of it owned by the company. When a recession hits and Pullman slashes wages by roughly a quarter, it does not lower rents or store prices to match, which even by 1894 standards strikes people as a little rich. Workers walk out, and the American Railway Union, led by a rising labor organizer named Eugene Debs, throws its support behind them, launching a boycott that has union members nationwide refusing to handle any train carrying a Pullman car, which in practice grinds a huge portion of the country's rail traffic to a halt. President Grover Cleveland, over the objections of Illinois Governor John Altgeld, who argued the state had it handled, sends in federal troops on the legal theory that the strike is interfering with the U.S. mail. Violence spreads across rail yards in multiple states, and by the time it's over, roughly 30 people are dead. Debs himself goes to jail for defying a court injunction. An experience that, depending on how much you already know about this channel's earlier facts, will matter again down the line. Here's the part that reads like a guilty conscience dressed up as a holiday. Just 6 days after federal troops crush the strike, Congress unanimously rushes through a bill making Labor Day a federal holiday, and Cleveland signs it almost immediately. It is, by most historians' reading, a deliberate olive branch to an organized labor movement the government had just finished putting down with soldiers. It's also the specific reason the United States marks its labor holiday on a quiet Monday in September, while most of the rest of the world marks International Workers' Day on the 1st of May, a date that actually commemorates a separate, earlier confrontation between labor and police in Chicago. Washington, it turns out, wanted its own version, on its own calendar, one that didn't share a date with a memory quite so uncomfortable. And if you think being shipped off by federal troops sounds bad, fact number 20 involves being shipped off in cattle cars by your own neighbors. The Bisbee Deportation, July 12, 1917. Bisbee, Arizona, is a copper mining town, and copper is wartime money, which makes a strike there, organized largely through the industrial workers of the world overpay, safety, and a bonus system miners considered rigged, extremely unwelcome to the mining companies, chief among them Phelps Dodge. Cochise County Sheriff Harry Wheeler responds by deputizing roughly 2,000 men on the spot, essentially the entire able-bodied non-striking population of the town, arming them and rounding up around 1,200 striking miners and anyone suspected of sympathizing with them at gunpoint. The captured men are marched to a local ballpark, given an ultimatum to renounce the Union or be forced out, and then loaded into cattle cars and boxcars borrowed from the local railroad. The train hauls them roughly 200 miles across the state line and abandons them in the New Mexico desert near a rail siding called Hermanus, without food, water, or any clear way home. Federal troops eventually arrive to take charge of the stranded men, but despite a federal grand jury eventually indicting company officials and Sheriff Wheeler's own posse for kidnapping, the case gets tossed on jurisdictional grounds, the theory being that Arizona, not the federal government, should have prosecuted it, and Arizona never did. A subsequent presidential mediation commission, appointed by Woodrow Wilson to investigate labor unrest nationwide, concluded the deportation was carried out without legal authority of any kind. It didn't matter. Nobody to this day has ever been convicted for it, and Phelps Dodge kept right on operating the mine. 4 strikes, 4 very different weapons turned on American workers, machine guns and fire, homemade bombs dropped from the sky, federal troops breaking a boycott, and an entire town's population deputized to force its own neighbors onto cattle cars. And in every one of these, it was at least still individual strikers who could, in theory, pack up and start over somewhere else once it was done. Coming up next, we get to a story where an entire prosperous black neighborhood, homes, businesses, churches, and all, is wiped off the map in about 16 hours, and there's no cattle car, no relocation, nothing left standing to even walk back to. If the Bisbee deportation was a sheriff's posse and a mining company erasing 1,300 strikers from a town in a single night, fact number 21 takes that same instinct, the instinct to erase, and turns it loose on an entire neighborhood, not for striking, just for existing and doing well. The Tulsa Race Massacre, May 31st to June 1st, 1921. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a district called Greenwood, 35 blocks of black-owned banks, hotels, grocery stores, movie theaters, doctors' and lawyers' offices, and a newspaper, dense enough and prosperous enough that people started calling it Black Wall Street years before the massacre, a nickname that outlived the neighborhood itself by a century. It started, as these things so often did, with an accusation. A young black shoeshiner named Dick Rowland was arrested after an encounter in an elevator with a white elevator operator, Sarah Page, the details of which were never established in any court because there was never a trial. A newspaper story and a threatened lynching outside the courthouse brought armed black veterans of the First World War to guard the jail. A shot went off. Nobody knows whose, and within hours, a mob of thousands of armed white Tulsans, some of them deputized on the spot by city officials, moved into Greenwood. Over roughly 16 hours, they burned it to the ground. Survivor and press accounts describe private airplanes overhead, some reportedly dropping incendiary devices onto rooftops, an accusation the city has never fully resolved, but has also never disproven. By the next morning, more than 35 blocks were ash, an estimated 10,000 people were homeless, and the death toll, officially recorded at the time as around 3 dozen, was reassessed by a state commission in 2001 to be as many as 300, based on mass grave sites. Investigators are still excavating in Tulsa cemeteries a century later. Survivors filed roughly $4 million in insurance claims. Nearly everyone was denied, because the policies carried standard clauses excluding damage caused by, in the industry's own language, riot and civil commotion. Nobody was ever convicted of anything. In the massacre's immediate aftermath, the city itself declared martial law and had the National Guard round up thousands of Greenwood's surviving residents into internment sites at the fairgrounds and a downtown convention hall, holding some of them for days and requiring signed release cards from a white employer before they could leave. And for most of the following century, Oklahoma classrooms simply didn't teach it, the massacre absent from the state's own history curriculum until well into the 2000s. A Department of Justice review reopened the case in 2025, confirmed it as a coordinated, racially targeted attack, and then reached the conclusion any investigation opened 100 years late reaches. Everyone responsible was already dead. In 2024, the last known survivors, by then well into their hundreds in age, sued the city for reparations, Oklahoma's Supreme Court dismissed the case a year before that Justice Department review even landed. Fact number 22 goes back further, to a coup, the only one in American history that actually worked. Wilmington, North Carolina, November 10, 1898. Wilmington had an elected biracial city government, black and white officials serving together under what was called fusion politics, and a thriving black-owned newspaper, the Daily Record, edited by Alexander Manly. A coordinated campaign by white Democratic Party leaders in the city, men with names still on record, spent months building toward Election Day with rallies and armed drilling. 2 days after the election, several hundred to as many as 2,000 armed men marched on the Daily Record's offices and burned the building down. Then they moved into black neighborhoods. Estimates of the dead run from roughly 60 to several times that. Nobody kept a reliable count while it was happening, and many of the killed were never formally identified. That same day, the men behind the violence forced the city's elected officials at gunpoint to resign on the spot and installed one of the coup's organizers, Alfred Waddell, as mayor. Days earlier, Waddell had stood before a crowd and, according to contemporary newspaper accounts, promised to choke the Cape Fear River with bodies if necessary. A group of white citizens also circulated a document that day, styled as a White Declaration of Independence, demanding Alexander Manly leave the city within 24 hours. He fled north and never returned. It is to date the only successful overthrow of an elected government in United States history. No one was ever prosecuted, not then, not for 100 years, until a North Carolina Legislative Commission investigated in 2006 and formally acknowledged what had happened as an act of insurrection, not a riot. Fact 23 moves to rural Arkansas, and a story where the violence follows an attempt to organize, much like Bisbee, except this time the organizers weren't miners, they were sharecroppers, and the debt they were trying to escape wasn't a company store. It was a system of cotton pricing that kept them perpetually owing the very landowners they picked for. Elaine, Arkansas, September 1919, part of what's remembered nationally as Red Summer. Black cotton farmers in Phillips County had formed a union, the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America, to negotiate fairer prices for their crops from white landowners. They were meeting at a church near Burr when shots were fired outside. Who fired first has never been settled. In the days that followed, armed white possessists, joined eventually by federal troops sent from a nearby army base, swept through the county. Estimates of how many died vary enormously, and historians are candid about that uncertainty, from just over 100 confirmed to more than 200, with some researchers arguing the real number could be considerably higher, since many of the dead were buried without any official record at all. The NAACP sent an investigator, Walter White, who was light-skinned enough to pass among the white officials he interviewed and gathered accounts of the violence before local authorities realized who he actually worked for and ran him out of the county. In the aftermath, 12 black men were tried, in proceedings conducted under the threat of mob violence outside the courtroom, and confessions later shown to have been coerced, and sentenced to death, while not a single white participant faced comparable charges for the killings. Their case worked its way to the Supreme Court, and in 1923, in Moore v. Dempsey, the court ruled that a trial dominated by mob pressure violates due process, opening the door for federal courts to review state convictions in a way they largely hadn't before. It's one of the more consequential Supreme Court cases most people have never heard of, and it came directly out of Elaine. And that brings us to fact 24, a town that simply isn't there anymore. Rosewood, Florida, January 1923. Rosewood was a small, self-sufficient, mostly black community with its own churches, a school, and several black-owned homes and businesses in Levy County. The violence began after a white woman in a neighboring town, Fannie Taylor, accused a black man of assaulting her, an accusation that was never verified and that some accounts, including from her own family decades later, cast serious doubt on. A mob formed anyway. Over about a week, they hunted through Rosewood, burned nearly every structure standing, and killed an unknown number of residents, officially recorded as a handful, though survivors always insisted it was more, and definitive records simply don't exist. One Rosewood resident, Sylvester Carrier, held off part of the mob from inside his mother's house for a night before he was killed, an episode that only seemed to escalate the violence that followed. Residents who escaped hid in nearby swamps for days before two train conductors, John and William Bryce, quietly evacuated families out under cover of darkness. Rosewood was never rebuilt. It disappeared from Florida history for 60 years, until investigative reporting in the early 1980s brought survivors' accounts back into public view, prompting a state commission report in 1993. The following year, Florida's legislature passed a compensation law for Rosewood survivors and descendants, one of the first instances of an American state formally paying reparations for racial violence, an outcome that took 71 years to arrive. 4 towns, 4 decades, and in every case the same shape. A spark that was never proven in court, a mob that answered it anyway, officials who looked away or joined in, and a silence afterward that outlasted the people who lived through it, sometimes by 70 years or more before a commission, a lawsuit, or a reporter finally pried the file back open. But erasing a neighborhood at home was one thing. It turns out the wars fought overseas had their own version of the same story, the parts that made it into the newsreels and the parts that quietly didn't. Fact number 25 takes us back to the middle of the Civil War, and to a version of that war that has nothing to do with battlefields. The New York City draft riots, July 13th through 16th, 1863. Congress had passed a draft law that year with a built-in escape hatch. Any man selected could avoid service entirely by paying a $300 commutation fee or by hiring someone else to go in his place. $300 was roughly a year's wages for a laborer, which meant the war everyone was legally obligated to fight was, in practice, optional for anyone who could afford the fee. New York's working-class neighborhoods, many of them recent immigrants, mostly Irish, who had little say in a war they hadn't started and no ability to buy their way out of it, exploded when the first draft lottery numbers went up on a Saturday morning. What began as attacks on the draft office spread over 4 days into the largest civil disturbance in the country's history to that point. Rioters also turned violently on the city's black residents, lynching several men and burning the colored orphan asylum to the ground, though staff managed to evacuate all 230-some children inside before the flames reached them. Estimates of the total dead vary considerably, from just over 100 confirmed in official counts to numbers historians suspect ran meaningfully higher, since bodies were pulled from the harbor and buried anonymously for weeks afterward. The riot was serious enough that Union regiments were pulled directly off the field at Gettysburg, fresh from the war's bloodiest battle, and marched into Manhattan to put it down with artillery in the streets. Among the men who simply paid their way out entirely legally that year was a young lawyer named Grover Cleveland, who hired a substitute for exactly the kind of fee that had set Manhattan on fire, and went on to become president twice without it ever seriously denting his reputation. The draft, and its $300 loophole, stayed on the books for the rest of the war. Which brings us to fact 26, a different war, and a different kind of dangerous job nobody got to opt out of. Port Chicago, California, July 17, 1944. Port Chicago was a naval magazine on San Francisco Bay where enlisted sailors, the overwhelming majority of them black, loaded live bombs and shells onto cargo ships bound for the Pacific, work the Navy had never bothered to give them proper training for, under officers who reportedly timed the loading crews and bet on which team could move the most tonnage fastest. On the night of July 17th, something detonated on the pier. 320 men were killed instantly, more than half the Navy's entire black wartime death toll from a single event, and the blast was strong enough to be felt as a small earthquake, registering on seismographs across the region. 3 weeks later, survivors were ordered back to the same unsafe loading procedures, with no changes made and no additional training given. 50 of them refused. They were charged not with insubordination but with mutiny, a wartime capital charge, and convicted, drawing national attention from a young NAACP lawyer named Thurgood Marshall, who sat in on the trial and called it a case less about discipline than about race. Clemency came in 1946. A full formal Navy exoneration, wiping the mutiny convictions from the men's records entirely, didn't arrive until July of 2024, 80 years after the explosion, and long after every one of the Port Chicago 50 had died. The disaster is also widely credited by historians as one of the pressures that pushed the Navy toward desegregating its ranks, years before the rest of the military followed under a 1948 executive order. As for the town of Port Chicago itself, The explosion left it so close to an expanded munitions facility that the federal government eventually just bought the entire town out and relocated its residents in the 1960s, erasing the place from the map in a quieter, bureaucratic sort of way. Fact 27 is a ship, and it starts with the very weapon that ended the war. Those sailors were arming ships for the USS Indianapolis, July 1945. The Indianapolis had just completed a top-secret run delivering components for the atomic bomb that would fall on Hiroshima to the island of Tinian. No idea what exactly was in the crates, when a Japanese submarine torpedoed it in the Philippine Sea on its way back. The ship sank in about 12 minutes. Of roughly 1,200 men aboard, about 300 went down with the vessel immediately, and the remaining 900 or so were left floating in open ocean, exposed, dehydrated, and stalked by sharks for 4 straight days, because the Navy's own tracking systems failed to notice the ship was overdue and never sent a rescue. A failure survivors, and later investigators traced to at least 3 separate points where a distress signal or a missed check-in should have triggered an alarm. And simply didn't. Only around 316 men were pulled out alive. In the aftermath, the Navy court-martialed the ship's captain, Charles McVeigh, for failing to steer an evasive zigzag course, and did so despite flying in the Japanese submarine commander, who'd actually fired the torpedoes, to testify, under oath, that zigzagging would have made no difference at all. McVeigh was convicted anyway, spent the rest of his career and life fielding hate mail from furious families of the dead, and took his own life in 1968. It took a schoolboy's history fair project, 12-year-old Hunter Scott interviewing dozens of survivors decades later to reopen the case, and in the year 2000, Congress and the Navy formally cleared McVeigh's name, 55 years after the fact and 32 years too late for the man himself. The survivors who were left kept meeting every year for reunions and lobbying on McVeigh's behalf right up until the exoneration, and the wreck of the ship itself wasn't actually located, sitting more than 3 miles down in the Philippine Sea, until a research expedition found it in 2017. And that brings us to fact 28, which is the one most people actually do know half of. The Doolittle Raid, April 1942, and what happened after it. 16 Army bombers, launched off the deck of the USS Hornet under Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, struck Tokyo just months after Pearl Harbor, a morale-boosting jab that couldn't do much real damage but proved Japan's home islands weren't untouchable. Doolittle himself assumed the mission had been a failure, having lost every single aircraft involved, and expected to face a court-martial when he got home. Instead, he came back to a promotion and the Medal of Honor. Most of the crews, low on fuel with nowhere safe to land, bailed out or crash-landed across occupied China, where local villagers and Chinese nationalist forces sheltered, fed, and smuggled the vast majority of the airmen to safety at real risk to themselves. That's the part that made the movies. What didn't make them is the retaliation. The Imperial Japanese Army responded with a months-long campaign through the Chinese provinces believed to have helped the flyers, in what became known as the Zhejiang Jiangxi Campaign, burning towns, poisoning wells, and, by some historians' estimates, killing as many as 250,000 Chinese civilians in the search for the airmen, and as punishment for those who'd hidden them, some accounts describing entire villages destroyed on suspicion alone. American intelligence picked up word of the reprisals within months, but the full scale of what had happened wasn't widely documented in English-language histories until decades afterward, once researchers began working through Chinese and Japanese wartime records that the original American after-action reports focused entirely on the raid's own success, never bothered to include. The raid itself is a staple of American war documentaries, replayed every anniversary with genuine pride. The 250,000 people who may have paid for it rarely get a mention in the same broadcast. 4 wars, 4 separate versions of the story the country agreed to remember, and the parts it quietly, almost politely, chose to leave out: a rich man's loophole, an unsafe pier, 4 days adrift in shark-filled water, and a reprisal carried out an ocean away from anyone who'd ever hear about it back home. Every one of those stories happened somewhere the fighting was. But it turns out the government didn't need a battlefield to run an operation on its own people, and some of the strangest wartime chapters never left home at all, starting with the machine built to make sure everyone believed the same version of the war in the first place. You don't actually need a war fought overseas to find a government managing its own citizens like a security problem. Sometimes the front line was your street, and the machine built to make sure everyone believed the same version of the war started right there, at home. Fact number 29 rewinds the clock a generation. Back to the first time Washington decided that what Americans said in their own homes needed managing too. It's 1917. The United States has just entered the First World War, and the Wilson administration stands up something called the Committee on Public Information, run by a former journalist named George Creel. Its job, officially, is public morale. Unofficially, it becomes the most sophisticated propaganda operation the country had ever built. Creel recruits roughly 75,000 volunteer speakers, nicknamed the 4-Minute Men, who fan out into movie theaters, churches, and union halls to deliver short, punchy, pro-war speeches timed to the length of a film reel change. 75,000 ordinary Americans, doctors, lawyers, shopkeepers, standing up between newsreels to sell the war to their own neighbors. That alone might just sound like enthusiastic messaging. What makes it darker is who was watching the audience. A private group called the American Protective League, roughly 250,000 civilian volunteers, gets semi-official blessing from the Justice Department to carry badges that look convincingly like federal credentials and to report on their neighbors' loyalty. They open mail. They infiltrate union meetings and immigrant social clubs. They compile files on neighbors whose main offense was speaking German at home or declining to buy war bonds enthusiastically enough. And in cities across the country, they help stage so-called slacker raids, sweeps where police and league volunteers stop men on the street, in theaters, even at baseball games, and demand proof they'd registered for the draft. One raid over a single weekend in New York City in September 1918 swept up an estimated 50,000 to 60,000 men, detaining most of them for hours or days before releasing all but a small fraction who'd actually dodged anything. The Justice Department later admitted the operation had gone too far. Nobody involved ever faced consequences for it. Creel himself reportedly described the whole committee as the world's greatest adventure in advertising, which is one way to describe a government office that produced roughly 75 million pieces of pro-war print, along with the same Congress that funded it passing a new Espionage Act in 1917 and a Sedition Act the following year, laws broad enough to criminalize a wide range of spoken and printed criticism of the war effort. Those two laws are about to matter a great deal to the next man on this list, which is the kind of environment where saying the wrong thing out loud could cost you your freedom. And fact number 30 is exactly what that cost looked like for one man in particular. Eugene Debs, prisoner number 9653. Debs was already a familiar name by 1918, a labor organizer and, by that point, a 5-time Socialist Party presidential candidate in his 60s when he gave a speech in Canton, Ohio, mostly about class struggle, that happened to criticize U.S. involvement in the war and praise a handful of men jailed for resisting the draft. That was enough. He was arrested under that new Espionage Act, the same law used to jail newspapermen and immigrant organizers throughout the war, and at trial he told the court plainly that he'd say it all again, that he had a right to say what he'd said. The jury convicted him anyway. In 1919, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld the conviction, ruling that his words carried what the opinion called a natural tendency to obstruct recruitment. He was sentenced to 10 years and shipped off to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. And here's the part that never quite fits the shape of the story you'd expect. Debs ran for president from that cell in the 1920 election, campaign literature printed with his prison number under his name, and roughly 913,000 Americans voted for a man who was, at the time, literally incarcerated by the government he was campaigning to lead. He never once set foot outside the prison gates for a rally. President Harding, from an entirely different administration than the one that jailed him, commuted his sentence on Christmas Day in 1921 and even invited Debs to the White House for a private meeting before he went home. Debs reportedly told reporters afterward that he bore Harding no personal ill will, and by then his health had suffered badly enough in prison that he'd only live another 5 years as a free man. The Espionage Act, meanwhile, is still on the books, amended and reargued in new decades, right up through the present one. The government's next move was relocating people it had decided to worry about. Fact number 31 is the internment story that doesn't usually make it into the same paragraph as the one you already know. You've likely heard, at least in outline, about the roughly 120,000 Japanese Americans forced from the West Coast into internment camps starting in 1942. What rarely gets added is that U.S. officials went well past their own borders to fill those camps further. Working with several Latin American governments, especially Peru, The State Department and War Department arranged for roughly 2,200 people of Japanese descent, many of them Peruvian citizens or longtime residents who had never once set foot in the United States, to be rounded up, stripped of their passports, and shipped north under guard. The stated purpose was blunt: build a stockpile of hostages to trade for American citizens held by Japan. Some were used in exactly that kind of prisoner exchange. Others simply sat out the war behind fences at a facility in Crystal City, Texas, built specifically to hold whole families together, alongside German and Italian nationals swept up under similar programs. And when the war ended, most weren't allowed to return to the countries that had exiled them in the first place, because Peru, among others, refused to take them back. Instead, hundreds were deported to Japan, a country a great many of them had never lived in and didn't necessarily still call home. A smaller number successfully fought to remain in the United States instead, often after years spent in legal limbo without valid immigration status, since they'd technically entered the country illegally by being kidnapped into it. It took until the 1990s and a class action lawsuit for the government to offer any of the Peruvian Japanese survivors compensation. And even then, at roughly a fifth of what Japanese American citizens received under the 1988 Civil Liberties Act, a gap survivors and historians alike still point to as evidence of how differently the two groups were treated for what was, at its core, the same wartime policy. And if you think that accounts for every group the wartime government decided to relocate for its own convenience, fact number 32 says otherwise, and this one happened entirely within U.S. territory to people who never left it at all. The Aleut Internment, 1942. After Japanese forces occupied the islands of Attu and Kiska in Alaska's Aleutian chain, the U.S. government evacuated roughly 900 Onangaks, commonly known as Aleuts, from villages across the Aleutians and the Pribilof Islands, ostensibly for their own safety. They weren't relocated to anywhere resembling safety. Most were shipped south to abandoned canneries and a former herring saltery near sites like Funter Bay and Killisnoo in southeast Alaska, buildings with no running water, inadequate heating, and overcrowding that let disease spread fast through communities with nowhere else to go. Roughly 1 in 10 of the people evacuated died in those camps over the following 2 to 3 years, from tuberculosis, influenza, and conditions the government's own later investigations described as neglect. Back in the Aleutians, meanwhile, U.S. military personnel occupying the emptied villages reportedly looted homes and churches while their owners sat in southeast Alaska waiting to be allowed back, and at least one village, Attu, was never resettled after the war at all, its residents scattered permanently to other communities. It would take until 1988, the same year Japanese-American internment reparations passed, for the Aleut and Pribilof Islands Restitution Act to formally apologize and compensate survivors, decades after many of the men, women, and children who suffered in those canneries were already gone. And on that note, we're 32 facts into this particular walk through the archives. Your eyelids should be doing that heavy, sandy thing by now. Just 18 facts left before we're done for the night. Fact number 33 picks up right where the last section left off, with the government reaching directly into people's bodies. Except this time it's not wartime paranoia providing the excuse. It's cold, deliberate science with a courtroom stamp of approval attached. Buck v. Bell, 1927. Carrie Buck was a young Virginia woman committed to a state colony for what officials at the time called the feeble-minded, largely because of poverty and a pregnancy that resulted from an assault, not because of any properly established disability. Virginia wanted to sterilize her under a new eugenics law, and her case, effectively engineered as a test case by supporters of the law rather than fought as a genuine defense, went all the way to the Supreme Court. The court ruled 8-1 in favor of the state. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the opinion, and it contains a line still taught in law schools as one of the coldest sentences in American jurisprudence. It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Carrie Buck's own attorney, notably, had close ties to the colony superintendent and mounted what historians now regard as a deliberately weak defense, since the whole point of the case was to get a sterilization law upheld, not to win. Carrie Buck was sterilized shortly after. So was her sister, under the false pretext of an appendectomy. The ruling didn't stay academic. Over the following decades, an estimated 60 to 70,000 Americans were sterilized under similar state laws, disproportionately people in institutions, the poor, and, in a number of states, women who'd gone in for entirely unrelated medical care and left the hospital unable to have children without ever consenting to the procedure. We've told you about Tuskegee on this channel before, and this is something of a cousin story to it, minus the decades of quiet observation and plus an operating table. California alone accounted for roughly a third of all sterilizations performed nationwide. Some state programs didn't wind down until the 1970s. Buck v. Bell was later cited approvingly at the Nuremberg trials by lawyers defending Nazi doctors on trial for their own sterilization programs, arguing they were simply following the American example. And Buck v. Bell, as a legal precedent, has never technically been overturned. It's simply been quietly ignored, which in American law isn't quite the same thing as gone. Which brings us to a drug you very likely have an opinion about, and a group of women who were never told they were the ones testing it. The Pills Puerto Rico trials, 1956. Researchers developing what would become the first oral contraceptive needed a large-scale human trial, and several mainland U.S. states had laws restricting contraception research at the time. Puerto Rico didn't, so researchers set up trials in the Rio Piedras neighborhood of San Juan, recruiting mostly poor and working-class women, many of whom were told only that they were taking a drug that prevented pregnancy, not that it was an experimental compound at a dosage nobody had tested at that scale before. The trial's lead researchers included Gregory Pincus and, running the on-the-ground clinical work, Dr. Edris Rice-Ray, who reported the side effect rate to her sponsors as too high for general use and was essentially overruled. Side effects showed up fast: nausea, dizziness, blood clots, and in 3 cases, deaths that were never seriously investigated for a possible connection to the trial. Researchers largely dismissed the complaints as, in their own written assessments, psychosomatic reactions from women who couldn't handle the medication, rather than as a signal that the dosage itself was the problem. It was. The pill used in the Puerto Rico trials contained roughly 10 times the hormone dose later found necessary for the drug to actually work, a fact only established once the side effects prompted separate, smaller safety studies back on the mainland. The drug that resulted went on to reshape reproductive choices across a country that had exported its riskiest testing to an island whose residents couldn't vote for the Congress governing them. Puerto Rico, notably, still can't. Fact number 34's experiment at least aimed, however badly the details were handled, to eventually help the women testing it. Fact 35 has no such defense, because the sponsors weren't even pretending it was about the subject's welfare. Holmesburg Prison, 1951 to 1974. Inside a Philadelphia County jail, a University of Pennsylvania dermatologist named Albert Kligman ran one of the longest human experimentation programs in American history, with the facility's full blessing. Kligman later told a reporter that walking into Holmesburg for the first time, seeing rows of inmates, his reaction was, quote, "All I saw before me were acres of skin." So that's what he used. Over more than 2 decades, inmates, paid small sums for participation and often unclear on exactly what they were being exposed to, had their skin tested with foot powders, deodorants, skin creams, radioactive isotopes, and, in one especially notorious program funded by Dow Chemical, dioxin, the toxic compound later linked to Agent Orange, applied at doses far beyond anything considered acceptable today. The subjects were disproportionately poor men with few other options for income inside the prison system. Cosmetic and pharmaceutical companies paid for a lot of it, Johnson & Johnson and Dow among them, along with the U.S. Army, which used inmates to test skin's reaction to chemical warfare agents, and by some later accounts, intelligence agencies that folded in research adjacent to their own chemical and psychological programs from the same era. The experiments didn't stop because anyone in charge developed a conscience. They stopped in the 1970s, after a wave of federal research ethics guidelines tightened in the wake of broader scandals breaking around the same years. Kligman went on to have a long, celebrated career in dermatology. He's also credited as a co-inventor of Retin A, the acne treatment sitting in a lot of medicine cabinets right now, developed on a research foundation Holmesburg helped provide him. And if experimenting on prisoners without much regard for the consequences feels dark enough, fact number 36 is the one where the subjects weren't even told an experiment was happening to their bodies at all. The plutonium injections, 1945 to 1947. As the Manhattan Project raced forward, scientists needed to understand what actually happens inside a human body exposed to plutonium, information that mattered enormously for protecting the project's own workers. So doctors working with government funding injected 18 hospital patients at facilities including sites in Tennessee, Illinois, and California with plutonium without telling them what was actually in the syringe. Patients were selected partly because doctors believed, often incorrectly, that they were terminally ill already and wouldn't live long enough for it to matter much. One of them, a house painter named Albert Stevens who'd been misdiagnosed with terminal stomach cancer, actually had a treatable ulcer instead. He lived for another 20 years after his injection, unknowingly carrying the highest cumulative radiation dose ever recorded in a human being, a record that, as far as anyone has determined, still stands today. Among the other 17 was a 4-year-old boy from California, injected without his parents ever being told what the shot actually contained. He died less than a year later, and researchers reportedly used his case data anyway. The program stayed classified for decades. Families were told, on the rare occasions they were told anything, that their relatives had received routine treatment. The truth surfaced through the work of investigative journalist Eileen Wellsome, whose 1990s newspaper series on the plutonium patients eventually won a Pulitzer Prize and forced the whole story into daylight. In response, the Clinton administration formally apologized in 1995 and convened the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, which went on to uncover not just the 18 plutonium patients, but a much wider web of Cold War-era radiation testing conducted on Americans who had never agreed to any of it in hospitals, schools, and institutions across the country. The committee's final report ran to more than 900 pages, and several surviving families received settlements, though most were modest, given that the harm in question had been quietly compounding for close to 50 years by the time anyone official admitted it happened. Which, it turns out, is a good note to leave on, because the government's appetite for radiation experiments didn't stop at individual patients and individual hospital beds. Sometimes, as we're about to see, an entire landscape made a perfectly good test subject too. So if injecting 18 unsuspecting hospital patients with plutonium sounds like the outer edge of what the atomic age was willing to try, fact number 37 shows the government thinking bigger. Why stop at bodies when you can experiment on an entire landscape instead? The Green Run, December 1949. At the Hanford site in eastern Washington, the same facility that had produced plutonium for the bomb dropped on Nagasaki, scientists working for the Atomic Energy Commission wanted to know something specific. If the Soviets were secretly running a plutonium reactor somewhere, could American intelligence detect it by sampling radioactive iodine drifting downwind? To find out, they needed a realistic plume to test their detection equipment against. So instead of letting uranium fuel rods cool and age for months before processing, the way procedure normally required, Hanford deliberately processed fuel that was still fresh, or green, releasing far more radioactive iodine-131 into the air than a standard run ever would. Estimates of how much iodine-131 escaped that week vary, with some historical assessments putting it at several thousand curies. But whatever the precise number, it was a deliberate, oversized release, aimed directly at the farm country of south-central Washington. The plume drifted over Richland, Pasco, and small agricultural towns for miles around, settling onto pastures where dairy cows grazed, and from there into the local milk supply, one of the most efficient ways radioactive iodine finds its way into a human thyroid. Nobody living downwind was told the test had happened at all. The people out there just went on drinking their milk and raising their kids as usual, while, according to later accounts, aircraft flew sampling runs through the plume to see how far the iodine could be tracked and measured. The full story didn't surface until 1986, when a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit forced Hanford's operators to declassify documents describing the test 37 years after the fact. Congress eventually funded health studies of the surrounding downwinder population, and the Hanford Health Information Network spent years afterward trying to reconstruct exactly how much radioactive iodine individual families had actually been exposed to, an inexact science when the exposure itself had been kept secret for decades. Lawsuits over thyroid disease followed for years, with mixed results in court. And Hanford, it turns out, was just the opening act. Which brings us to fact number 38, and a much bigger stretch of the American Southwest that spent over a decade breathing in the government's homework. The downwinders. Between 1951 and 1962, The United States detonated roughly 100 nuclear devices above ground at the Nevada test site, a patch of desert barely 100 miles from Las Vegas. The mushroom clouds were, for a while, treated as a tourist attraction, with casinos scheduling cocktail parties around blast times. But the fallout didn't stay politely inside the test site's boundary. Wind carried radioactive dust northeast, over St. George and other small towns in Utah, and into parts of Arizona and Nevada itself, coating gardens, water supplies, and the wool of grazing sheep. Ranchers reported strange sores and mass sheep deaths in the months after certain tests, including a 1953 shot in a series nicknamed Upshot No Hole that blanketed the region in fallout so heavy that dosimeters at the test site itself reportedly went off scale. Government investigators concluded the animals had died of malnutrition and cold, a finding many local ranchers never accepted. St. George, Utah sat close enough to the test site that it later picked up a grim nickname of its own, Fallout City, and years afterward became a talking point for an entirely different reason. A film crew shooting a John Wayne movie on location nearby in the mid-1950s saw an unusually high number of cast and crew later diagnosed with cancer. Something many people connect to the fallout, though statisticians point out that with a cast and crew of only a few hundred people, it's genuinely hard to prove the connection rather than coincidence. What we know for certain, because it's sitting in the Atomic Energy Commission's own paperwork, is how officials privately described the people living in the fallout's path. One internal memo referred to the surrounding population as, and this is the actual phrase, a low-use segment of the population, the kind of bureaucratic language you use when you've already decided some Americans are more expendable than others. Cancer rates in the region, particularly leukemia and thyroid cancer, climbed in the decades that followed. A pattern researchers have connected to the fallout, though as with most large-scale epidemiology, exact numbers of attributable cases remain debated among scientists. What isn't debated is that Congress eventually acknowledged the harm. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, passed in 1990, has since paid out billions of dollars to downwinders, uranium miners, and nuclear test workers, an unusually direct admission by government standards that a low-use segment of the population had in fact been telling the truth the whole time. Fact number 39 takes the radiation out of the desert entirely and puts it 250 miles above the Pacific Ocean. Starfish Prime, July 1962. As part of a series of high-altitude nuclear tests called Operation Fishbowl, the United States launched a 1.4 megaton thermonuclear warhead into space on a rocket from Johnston Atoll and detonated it roughly 250 miles above the Pacific, well outside the atmosphere. The goal was partly to see what a nuclear explosion in space would actually do, including whether it might be useful for knocking out incoming Soviet missiles. What it did immediately was light up the night sky across a huge stretch of the Pacific in an artificial aurora visible as far away as New Zealand, and knock out streetlights, blow fuses, and trip burglar alarms across Honolulu, roughly 900 miles from the detonation point, as the electromagnetic pulse rolled through the island's electrical grid. The blast also injected a burst of high-energy electrons into the Earth's magnetic field, creating an artificial radiation belt that lingered in orbit for years. Several satellites, including one of the first commercial communications satellites, Telstar, suffered damage or outright failure from that radiation in the months that followed, a fairly awkward side effect for a test meant to demonstrate American technical dominance. Scientists tracking the resulting radiation belt found that pieces of it lingered in orbit for years afterward, still measurable well into the following decade. Starfish Prime remains, to this day, the largest nuclear detonation ever conducted in space, and one of the clearer illustrations that the Cold War's competitive instincts didn't stop at the edge of the atmosphere. It also, by simple accident of geography, gave a few 100,000 people in Honolulu a genuinely spectacular light show they had absolutely no idea their own government had scheduled. Which leads naturally into fact number 40, because if you can lose track of the side effects of a bomb you detonated on purpose, you can imagine how well the government kept tabs on the bombs it lost by accident. Broken arrows. That's the military's own official term for a serious accident involving a nuclear weapon, and the Pentagon acknowledges 32 of them on the public record. Everything from weapons dropped from planes by mistake to fires and crashes involving live warheads. 2 stand out. In January 1961, a B-52 bomber broke apart in midair over Goldsboro, North Carolina, releasing 2 live hydrogen bombs as it disintegrated. One bomb's parachute deployed as designed, and it drifted down to hang from a tree, largely intact, with several of its safety mechanisms in the armed position. A senior engineer at Sandia National Laboratories who reviewed the incident years later, in documents only declassified in 2013 after a Freedom of Information Act request, concluded that of the bomb's 4 separate safety switches, 3 had failed to prevent detonation during the fall, and only one, a low-voltage arm-safe switch not designed to be a last line of defense, stood between Goldsboro and a nuclear explosion many times larger than Hiroshima. The other bomb from that same crash was never fully recovered. Part of it remains buried in a North Carolina field the Army later purchased an easement over, just to be safe. The second incident happened 3 years earlier, off the Georgia coast. In February 1958, a B-47 collided with a fighter jet during a training exercise near Savannah, and rather than risk landing with a live hydrogen bomb strapped to a damaged aircraft, the crew jettisoned it into the shallow waters of Wassaw Sound, off Tybee Island. Despite repeated Air Force searches at the time and follow-up expeditions in the decades since, the bomb has never been found, and it is presumed to still be resting somewhere in the mud off the Georgia coast, a piece of Cold War hardware quietly waiting to become somebody's very unlucky metal detector find. And once you've spent an afternoon with lost hydrogen bombs and irradiated dairy farms, it's honestly a relief to move into the parts of the Cold War the government dreamed up not out of paranoia, but out of what can only be described as pure, government-funded imagination. Fact number 41 starts us off with a question that apparently sounded reasonable in a Cold War planning meeting. What if we blew up the moon? Just a little, for morale. Project A119, 1958. In the wake of the Soviet Union launching Sputnik and thoroughly embarrassing American confidence in its own technology, the Air Force commissioned a classified study into detonating a nuclear weapon on the lunar surface. The idea wasn't military conquest of the moon. Exactly. It was public relations. A visible flash on the lunar surface, bright enough to see from Earth with the naked eye, would supposedly prove American rocketry could hit a target hundreds of thousands of miles away and give a nervous public something dramatic to feel good about. The plan called for a small warhead, deliberately modest, so the detonation flash would actually be visible against the moon's own glare rather than getting lost in it, timed to go off along the lunar terminator, the line between light and dark, for maximum visual contrast. Among the researchers doing the calculations for how visible the resulting cloud would be from Earth was a young astronomer named Carl Sagan, years before he became one of the most recognizable science communicators in American history, and he later referenced the project, carefully, in a job application, which is part of how the whole thing eventually came to light. The Air Force ultimately shelved the idea, partly over fears of public backlash if a nuclear test on the moon went wrong, and partly because it risked contaminating a pristine research target scientists actually wanted to study intact. The plan stayed classified for decades, and only became public in the late 1990s, when a former project physicist, Leonard Reifel, went on record about it. Interestingly, declassified Soviet records suggest their own space program was quietly studying something similar around the same period, so this wasn't even a uniquely American impulse. Both sides of the Cold War independently arrived at nuke the moon for the cameras, as a reasonable use of a rocket program. So somewhere in an Air Force filing cabinet, there is a real, seriously considered engineering study for detonating a nuclear weapon on the moon as a marketing exercise. Fact number 42 keeps the nuclear ambitions but moves from outer space to somewhere almost as inhospitable, underneath a Greenland ice sheet. Camp Century, 1959 to 1966. The United States Army built what it publicly described as a research station, a network of tunnels carved into the Greenland ice cap and powered by a portable nuclear reactor, complete with living quarters, a chapel, a barbershop, and hot showers for the scientists supposedly studying polar engineering and ice core science up there. That research really did happen, and some of the ice core work from Camp Century remains scientifically valuable to this day. The Army was proud enough of the public-facing version that it produced promotional newsreel footage showing off the city under the ice as a showcase of American ingenuity, footage that was, by design, telling only half the story. But the base was also the visible cover for a much larger classified proposal called Project Iceworm, a plan to bury a network of tunnels stretching over thousands of miles of the ice sheet, housing up to roughly 600 mobile nuclear missiles within easy striking range of the Soviet Union, close enough to shave crucial minutes off any launch. There was one significant complication. Greenland belonged to Denmark, a NATO ally that had not been told what Camp Century actually was for. Denmark's own official policy at the time barred nuclear weapons on its territory, which made keeping Iceworm quiet somewhat important to the whole plan working. It never got the chance to matter. Engineers discovered that Greenland's ice sheet moves and shifts far more than anyone had accounted for, slowly crushing the tunnels and threatening to swallow the reactor along with them, and the army abandoned the whole project in 1966, dismantling what it could, and simply leaving the rest, including radioactive coolant and other waste, entombed under the ice on the assumption it would stay frozen forever. Denmark only learned the full extent of what had been planned on its own soil decades later, confirmed through a Danish parliamentary inquiry in 1997, and climate scientists now warn that a warming climate could eventually expose what Camp Century left behind. Which brings us to fact number 43, and the Central Intelligence Agency's brief, expensive detour into what can only be described as spy gadgetry that didn't work. The CIA's Animal Era. In a program that came to be known unofficially as Acoustic Kitty, agency researchers in the 1960s spent a reported sum in the millions of dollars surgically implanting a cat with a microphone, a small radio transmitter, and an antenna woven into its tail, the idea being that a cat could wander close enough to foreign officials in a park to eavesdrop without anyone suspecting an animal of espionage. According to a partially declassified CIA history released years later, the very first field test ended almost immediately when the cat, released near a target, wandered into the street and was struck by a taxi, and the program was quietly shelved not long after. Around the same era, and considerably less absurd in its implications, the Church Committee's 1975 congressional investigation into intelligence abuses revealed that the CIA had also developed a dart gun designed to deliver a frost-tipped poison dart so small the target might feel nothing more than what seemed like a mosquito bite, with a toxin engineered to mimic a heart attack and leave no detectable trace in an autopsy. CIA officials testified about the device, sometimes called the heart attack gun, directly to Congress on camera, holding the actual weapon up for the senators and the cameras to see, footage that still circulates today. Acoustic Kitty, for what it's worth, reportedly cost somewhere in the range of $15 to $20 million by some later accounts, a genuinely staggering sum for a single cat that lasted one field test. The Church Committee's investigation into these programs is part of why so much of what the CIA got up to during the Cold War is documented at all, rather than simply rumored. Fact number 44 takes us back up into orbit, for what might be the strangest of this batch, because at least a spy cat has a clear purpose. This one is several 100 million tiny copper needles. Project West Ford, 1961 to 1963. MIT's Lincoln Laboratory, working with the Air Force, wanted a reliable way to bounce radio signals around the globe that wouldn't depend on the ionosphere, which has a habit of being disrupted, or on vulnerable undersea cables and ground relay stations. Their solution was to launch hundreds of millions of tiny copper needles, each about the length of a grain of rice, into orbit, designed to spread out and form an artificial ring around the Earth. A sort of man-made radio reflector belt in the sky. The first launch attempt in 1961 failed, when the needles didn't disperse properly and clumped together instead. A second attempt in 1963 succeeded, releasing an estimated 480 million needles that spread into a workable orbital band, and researchers did briefly manage to bounce radio transmissions off the resulting cloud. Astronomers were considerably less thrilled, with scientists in the United States and abroad, including Soviet and British researchers who published formal objections, warning that filling near-Earth orbit with debris set a troubling precedent for how casually a single nation might treat the space above everyone else's heads, and some accused the United States of quietly polluting a shared environment nobody had agreed to let it use that way. The technology was obsolete within a few years anyway, made irrelevant by actual communications satellites. But not every needle came back down. Clumps of Project West Ford's copper needles are still tracked in orbit by astronomers today, a genuinely strange little constellation of Cold War litter still circling the planet. And that's 44 facts down, which means we're deep into the pillow now, with just 6 stories left before we let you drift off entirely. A nuclear test on the moon, a missile base hidden under an ally's ice sheet, a wired-up cat, and a cloud of copper needles that never quite came home. Let your shoulders drop for a second. You made it through the strange stretch. It's tempting to file all of this Cold War stuff under harmless government eccentricity and leave it there, a filing cabinet full of expensive, well-meaning weirdness. But not every chapter left out of your textbook was strange for the sake of strange. Some of them were about the government deciding quietly and repeatedly that entire groups of people simply didn't belong here anymore. Starting with a decade in the 1930s when hundreds of thousands of people, more than half of them United States citizens by birth, were pressured or shipped across a border many of them had never even seen. Which is a fittingly absurd place to leave the Cold War for a while. Copper needles still drifting in orbit because a handful of engineers were worried about radio blackouts. But not every strange decision this country made was about what to put in the sky. Some of the strangest decisions were about who got to stay on the ground. Because there have been more than a few moments in American history when a government agency or a mob operating with a government's quiet blessing decided an entire group of people simply had to leave. Fact number 45 is the biggest one, and it's a fact most Americans somehow finished 12 years of schooling without ever hearing. The Mexican repatriation, 1929 to 1936. The Great Depression hits, jobs vanish, and local and federal officials across the country start looking for someone to blame. In February 1931, Los Angeles County immigration officials and police stage a raid on La Placida Park downtown, sealing off the plaza and detaining hundreds of people on the spot. No warrant, no hearing, just a sweep of anyone who looked like they might be Mexican. That single raid became the template. County relief agencies in cities from Los Angeles to Detroit to Gary, Indiana quietly started conditioning public assistance on a one-way train ticket south, and welfare workers were sometimes sent door to door to encourage families to leave voluntarily, which in practice meant they left because staying had just become unaffordable. Nobody kept a clean national count at the time, so historians still argue about the scale. Estimates run from somewhere around 400,000 people to, by some counts, over 1 million, and a majority of them, by most estimates, were United States citizens by birth, children mostly, swept up because a parent was the actual target. Families who'd lived in the same California towns for 3 generations ended up in Mexican border cities where the kids didn't speak Spanish. It took historians Francisco Balderrama and Raymond Rodriguez decades of digging through relief agency ledgers and railroad manifests, published in 1995 as Decade of Betrayal, to even put a rough shape on how large the program had actually been, because at the time nobody in government was eager to keep detailed records of it. It barely registers in most textbooks. California didn't formally apologize until 2005, when the state legislature passed the Apology Act, acknowledging the repatriation program by name 70-plus years after it happened and offering no compensation, just an admission that it happened at all. Which, unfortunately, was not the first time an American community got told to leave on short notice, and this next one has a body count attached. Fact number 46. Through the 1880s, as Chinese immigrants who'd built the Transcontinental Railroad and worked mining claims across the West became convenient scapegoats for falling wages, entire towns decided to solve the problem directly rather than legislate it. In Rock Springs, Wyoming Territory, in September 1885, a mob of local miners attacked the town's Chinese quarter over a dispute at the coal mine, killing at least 28 people, wounding dozens more, and burning the neighborhood to the ground. A grand jury was convened, and it declined to indict anyone. That same November in Tacoma, Washington, the mayor and an organized crowd of local citizens marched the city's entire Chinese population, several hundred men, women, and children, several miles to a train depot in a single afternoon, then burned the Chinese district behind them once it was empty, a forced expulsion still remembered locally as the Tacoma method, because nearby Seattle actually studied it as a model. 2 years after that, in the remote basalt cliffs of Hell's Canyon on the Snake River, a small gang of horse thieves ambushed a group of Chinese gold miners working a claim, robbing and murdering somewhere around 34 of them, and dumping the bodies in the river. One member of the gang eventually confessed decades later. The men who stood trial in 1888 were acquitted by an all-white jury in under 20 minutes. It took until 2005 for the site to even get an official historical marker, renamed Chinese Massacre Cove. Rock Springs and Tacoma and Hell's Canyon weren't isolated incidents either. Smaller expulsions and killings hit mining and lumber towns from Eureka, California to Squaw Valley in Washington Territory across the same few years, a wave organized loosely enough that no single trial could ever capture it, which may be exactly why so few trials ever happened. All of it unfolded in the shadow of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first American law to ban immigration by nationality outright. That law stayed on the books, renewed again and again, until 1943, when Congress finally repealed it, not out of any reconsidered principle, but because China had become a wartime ally against Japan, and an exclusion law on the books was suddenly an embarrassing thing to explain to an ally. And speaking of a group of Americans who got the wrong kind of welcome home, fact number 47 belongs to the bonus army. It's the summer of 1932. The Depression is still cratering the economy, and more than 17,000 World War I veterans, many bringing wives and children, march on Washington and set up a sprawling camp, asking Congress to pay early on a service bonus they weren't legally due to collect until 1945. Congress votes it down. Most of the veterans stay anyway, camped along the Anacostia Flats in shacks built from packing crates and scavenged tin. In late July, President Hoover orders the Army to clear federal buildings the veterans had occupied, but not to touch the main camp across the river. The officer who carries out the operation, General Douglas MacArthur, decides otherwise, pressing across the bridge with cavalry, infantry, and 6 tanks anyway, convinced without evidence that the marchers were led by communist agitators. 2 aides on his staff that afternoon would later become considerably more famous. Major Dwight Eisenhower, who reportedly argued against the operation entirely, and later called it one of the more shameful chapters he witnessed, and Major George Patton, who personally led the cavalry charge. Troops advanced on unarmed veterans and their families with fixed bayonets and tear gas, and by nightfall the camp was in flames. Roughly 1,000 people, veterans, wives, children, were gassed in the chaos. Several died, including a nursing infant. It became one of the uglier photographs of the entire Depression, American soldiers driving out the American soldiers who'd served before them, and it cost Hoover badly at the ballot box that November, with newsreels of the burning camp playing in theaters nationwide. Hoover's own statement afterward insisted the marchers were riddled with criminals and revolutionaries. A subsequent count of arrest records found barely any prior convictions among them at all. A smaller second bonus march showed up in Washington the following spring under President Roosevelt, and Roosevelt handled it rather differently. No troops, coffee and camp cots arranged instead, and Eleanor Roosevelt herself walking through the muddy camp to talk with the veterans directly, which one marcher summarized afterward as Hoover sent the army, Roosevelt sent his wife. The postscript is at least a little satisfying, though. Congress finally paid the bonus in full in 1936, overriding a veto from President Roosevelt himself to make it happen. The men who'd been gassed off the Anacostia Flats had been right all along. They just had to outlast 4 more years of being told no. So that's 47 facts deep, and we've covered a country that has, at various points, deported its own citizens, burned out entire neighborhoods, and gassed the men it sent to war. You'd think we'd have run out of stories with that particular, this genuinely cannot be true quality. We haven't. These last 3 are the ones that, if you brought them up at a dinner party with no context, people would assume you were making them up. You're not. Fact number 48. And it starts with the wealthiest people per capita anywhere on Earth. The Osage Reign of Terror, 1920s Oklahoma. When oil is discovered under Osage land in the early 20th century, the Osage Nation, thanks to a legal arrangement that kept mineral rights collectively owned by tribal members, becomes staggeringly rich almost overnight, with headright shares paying out fortunes in a single quarter. And Congress responds to Native American citizens having that much money the way it apparently always did. It decides they can't be trusted to manage it. A 1921 law requires many Osage headright holders, based purely on being deemed incompetent, to have a court-appointed white guardian control their finances, sign off on their spending, and often skim a healthy cut along the way. Then people connected to those headrights start dying. Some are shot outright. Some die of poison slipped into food or bootleg whiskey, quiet enough to pass as illness at the time. In one especially brazen case in 1923, a house belonging to an Osage woman named Rita Smith is destroyed by a nighttime explosion, killing her, her husband, and their housekeeper, and flattening much of the block around it. Local law enforcement does little, and some of it, historians and later investigators found, was compromised, tied to the very guardians and cattlemen who stood to inherit the headrights, once the Osage holders were dead. Estimates of the total killed run from a few dozen documented cases into the low hundreds by some later accounts, because a number of deaths at the time were simply written off as natural causes without real investigation. It eventually became one of the first major homicide cases for a young Bureau of Investigation under a new director named J. Edgar Hoover. Investigators eventually traced that bombing, and a cluster of related killings, back to a cattleman named William Hale, sometimes called the King of the Osage Hills, who'd orchestrated the murders of his own nephew's Osage in-laws, Rita Smith among them, to funnel their head rights back through the family by marriage. Hale was convicted and sentenced to life in prison in 1929, then, in a detail that still stings, quietly paroled in 1947 for good behavior. The resulting convictions, Hale and a handful of hired men, put only a small dent in what was clearly a much wider pattern. The majority of Osage murders from that decade were never solved at all, a story that stayed relatively obscure until journalist David Grant's 2017 book brought it back into public view generations later. Which brings us to fact number 49, and this one happened recently enough that some of the people involved are still alive to talk about it. The Move bombing, Philadelphia, May 13, 1985. Move was a black liberation and back to nature group that had clashed with Philadelphia police for years, an earlier 1978 standoff already having left an officer dead. By 1985, Move members were occupying a row house on Osage Avenue, and after a lengthy standoff involving thousands of rounds of police gunfire into the building, Philadelphia's police commissioner, with the mayor's approval, made an extraordinary decision. A state police helicopter dropped a satchel bomb containing a military explosive directly onto the roof. The resulting fire was, by the city's own later admission, deliberately allowed to burn rather than immediately fought, with officials on scene reportedly choosing to let it consume the block instead of risking another confrontation. It killed 11 people inside the house, 5 of them children, and burned 61 homes to the ground across 2 city blocks, leaving hundreds of Philadelphia residents who had nothing to do with the standoff homeless. No city official was ever criminally charged. A city commission later called the bombing unconscionable. Only 2 people made it out of the house alive, 1 adult and 1 child. The surviving adult, Ramona Africa, was herself charged and served time for riot, while no police commander or city official ever faced a courtroom over any of it. The story kept resurfacing for decades afterward. As recently as 2021, it emerged that the remains of 2 of the children killed in the fire had been kept, without their families' knowledge or consent, by the medical examiner's office and university researchers for study, decades after the bombing. It took until 2020, 35 years later, for Philadelphia City Council to pass a formal apology, and the city didn't officially designate May 13th an annual day of reflection and atonement until that same year. And for fact number 50, our last one tonight, we're going somewhere quieter, and honestly stranger than anything involving bombs or gunfire. The secret presidency of Edith Wilson, 1919 to 1921. In October 1919, President Woodrow Wilson suffers a massive stroke while campaigning for the League of Nations, leaving him partially paralyzed and largely unable to carry out his duties. There's no clear constitutional mechanism yet for handling a disabled president, no 25th Amendment, nothing. That wouldn't exist for another 47 years. So Wilson's doctor and his second wife, Edith Wilson, make a decision together: keep the severity quiet, keep the president in bed, and keep the country from finding out how bad it really is. For roughly a year and a half, Edith Wilson controls what reaches her husband's desk, deciding which documents, visitors, and decisions are urgent enough to bring to him, and which simply get handled or quietly shelved without him ever seeing them at all. She always insisted, later, that she made no actual policy decisions herself, merely acted as a gatekeeper passing along her husband's wishes, a role she called her stewardship. Cabinet members and senators who wanted a meeting were often politely told the president wasn't available. Several began referring to her, not entirely as a joke, as the presidentress. When Senator Albert Fall, sent to check rumors that Wilson was incapacitated or worse, was finally allowed a brief bedside visit, he came out and told reporters only, "I have seen the president," offering no detail at all about what condition he'd actually found him in, which did more to fuel the rumors than quiet them. The vice president wasn't briefed. The public got vague statements about rest and recovery. Some historians frame it plainly as a woman quietly running the executive branch of the United States government. Others argue she was simply protecting a sick husband from being pushed out of office by rivals, and that the truth sits somewhere between the two. Either way, for about 18 months, the country's decisions passed through the hands of someone nobody had ever cast a single vote for, and almost nobody outside the White House knew it was happening. It's a strange, hushed little footnote, decades before anyone thought to write a constitutional amendment for exactly this situation. And it's as good a place as any to let this particular night's list come to rest. And that's 50. Officers flirting with a coup, a president marching an army against his own voters, court rulings simply ignored, an amendment that almost made slavery permanent, mobs that erased whole neighborhoods in an afternoon, a bomb dropped from a helicopter onto a city block, and a first lady quietly running the country from behind a bedroom door nobody was allowed to open. None of it was hidden by magic. There was no vault under a mountain, no shadow government keeping these stories out of your hands. It sat, the whole time, in court transcripts, congressional hearing records, declassified files, and newspaper archives gathering dust in university basements, exactly where we found it for you tonight. It just never made it into the version of American history handed out in a classroom, because that version has a limited number of pages and an understandable reluctance to make anyone uncomfortable before the bell rings. So what do you do with 50 facts like this rattling around in your head at 1 a.m? Not despair, and definitely not suspicion of the person next to you. Almost none of what you heard tonight was ordinary people being cruel to other ordinary people. It was institutions, specific officials, specific agencies, specific decisions made in specific rooms, choosing secrecy over honesty, and getting away with it for a while, sometimes a very long while. The lesson isn't to trust your neighbors less, it's to keep half an eye on the institutions that hold power over both of you, because the paper trail eventually surfaces and the receipts are, without exception, sitting in an archive somewhere collecting dust exactly the way tonight's 50 were, waiting for someone to go looking. That's the whole list. If a couple of these stick with you tomorrow, that's kind of the point of an archive. It's just sitting there either way. If you enjoyed drifting off to this one, there's always another dusty file waiting to be dug up next time. For now, though, let it go. The lights are low, the facts are filed away where they belong, and there's nothing left to do tonight but let your eyes close. Sleep well. History will still be there in the morning, dust and all.